We might just get on with the afternoon session if we could, folks. I think just about everybody's back. For those that don't know, Jim Reeves, who chaired the opening session, had to leave us. He's been appointed to the board of the Urban Land Development Authority, and he's been congratulated for that. But he's had to go off to his first board meeting, which is understandably important. So he's gone off, and you've got me for the rest of the afternoon, which unfortunately is probably not a good thing. Our next speaker is Jim Gard'ner. Jim studied architecture at Victoria University of Wellington and completed his training in building conservation at the Architectural Association of London. He's worked in private practice in New Zealand and the UK before coming to Australia, and he's had roles here as the Conservation Manager for the National Trust of Australia, and worked in a number of positions in the Victorian Department of Heritage Victoria, and is currently the Executive Director of that organisation. My first experience with Jim was with the Heritage Chairs of Australia and New Zealand meetings, which Jim attended on a number of occasions, I guess as a technical contributor to that, and certainly I have a huge amount of respect for his technical knowledge about heritage architecture. So Jim, without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, David.
I might just say, there's been a number of people suggesting that they can't actually see the presentation because of light, so we're going to attempt to dim the lights or even switch the lights off down the front here during the presentation, and we'll switch them back on in the meantime. So if that's better for people. Yep, okay.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, we're all here because there's obviously an increasing importance being placed on environmental sustainability in the built environment. What most of you know, obviously, is that buildings and their operation is a significant contributor to our energy use and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. What I think Ken will touch on shortly, but I think is an important issue to note, is that Australia has lagged behind the US and the UK in the understanding of key concepts in this discussion, such as embodied energy. But my personal view is that the heritage sector is at great risk of being seen as less relevant or out of touch if it doesn't actually address these issues, if it doesn't actually accept the need for necessary interventions to improve energy and water efficiency, and to be seen as part of the climate change solution, not as a blocker. Now, Lindsay earlier mentioned that there was not flexibility in changes to fabric. I'd disagree with that. You have to look at the significance of the fabric, and often a place will have fabric of varying levels of significance, and that will allow varying levels of change. We have to be able to enable appropriate levels of change to improve energy and water efficiency, but also to enable services upgrades and the introduction of things like microgeneration. So what I'm going to talk about today are a couple of studies which Victoria's led. These looked at the opportunities that exist for improving environmental performance of existing domestic and commercial buildings, ones which had heritage values, but I think arguably for the first time in Australia doing it with defendable, recognised research methods. I'll also outline the approach Victoria has taken to environmentally sustainability in terms of heritage places, and also look at some of the opportunities and strategies we have for improving environmental performance through retrofitting while retaining heritage values. But I'd like to start, as I often do these, with 4 of my favourite pieces of research on embodied energy. And these are my favourites, not that I'm not going to argue or go through their technical rigour, but rather in the compelling message they tell. The UK's Building Research Establishment Study Measurement of Residential Embodied Energy in Heritage Housing from 2003 identified that the embodied energy in a typical Victorian house contains the equivalent energy of 15,000 litres of petrol, or which is enough to send a car 5 times round the Earth or halfway to the moon. And if you think about it, and coming from the southern states, The typical London terrace is exactly the same as the typical Sydney or Melbourne terrace without the veranda. So those arguments, I think, hold true here. More recently in the UK's Empty Homes Agency, in its report New Tricks for Old Bricks, How Reusing Old Buildings Can Cut Carbon Emissions, identified that by reusing an empty home could make an initial saving of 35 tonnes of carbon dioxide per property by removing the necessity for the new energy locked up in new building materials and construction. And possibly more relevant, oh, sorry, I've gone straight past that one. Possibly more relevant to this discussion here when we're talking about commercial buildings is a study from Place Economics, which is a Washington, DC based economics and development consultancy, which identified that the environmental cost of demolishing the typical 8-metre wide by 40-metre deep commercial building of the type you'd find on any North American historic streetscape would wipe out the entire environmental benefit of recycling 1.3 million aluminium cans. And bringing it back home, and this is research which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of out of the 2001 Australian State of Environment report. In the Human Settlements Theme report, the CSIRO study identified that the energy embodied in the existing building stock in Australia is equivalent to approximately 10 years of the total energy consumption of the entire nation. Now, while the assessment and identification or quantification of embodied energy is not an exact science, I think these 4 examples tell a clear and compelling story of the magnitude, if not the exact amount, but the magnitude of energy that's wasted through the demolition of existing and historic buildings. And these 4 studies also tell it in a way that the public understand. The public don't understand petajoules or gigajoules. They understand Coke cans, they understand litres of petrol, and they understand increasingly tonnes of carbon, even if we unfortunately can't put a price on it yet. Now, what's Victoria done in this space? Well, the Heritage Council in 2008 embarked on the major research project I'll talk about shortly, but they also, as an interim measure, adopted a policy on heritage and sustainability. They identified that the conservation of heritage places makes an important contribution to the environmental, social and economic sustainability of the state. They noted that the environmental sustainability afforded by the retention of heritage places included a substantial reduction in building, demolition and new construction waste, and the conservation of embodied energy in existing buildings. They followed this with 2 technical leaflets, and these are all downloadable at our website, which is heritage.vic.gov.au. And these 2 technical notes were on heritage buildings and sustainability and heritage buildings and the energy efficiency regulations. These were, again, interim pieces of research, but effectively to raise awareness of the contribution of heritage conservation to sustainability through recognising the embodied energy in heritage buildings, developing an understanding of the environmental attributes of heritage buildings inherent in their materials and original design. And this was touched on earlier, things like thermal mass, traditional passive solar design, and traditional passive heating and cooling. And also to identify the main issues that needed to be addressed in optimising the performance of heritage buildings. The second of these guidance also stepped owners and designers through the requirements for meeting the BCA's deemed to satisfy provisions, and also what things you'd have to look at in developing a performance assessment report for alternative solutions. But as I say, these were really interim measures during the development of the 2 major projects. And the first of these is the Heritage and Sustainability Domestic Project, which started off in 2009 and initially looked at 10 case studies of domestic or domestically scaled institutional buildings in Victoria at sort of 20 to 30 year intervals. So we're covering everything from late Victorian terrace, freestanding Edwardian house, an interwar house, an apartment of 1930s flats, block of flats rather, post-war brick veneer of the kind, which is increasingly being recognised in Victoria in heritage overlay and other controls, middle suburban's house, and then a 2000s outer suburban house, a 5 or 6 star rated house, which would act as the control. But for sort of from a institutional commercial building side of things, we looked at 2 other buildings of large domestic scale, that is a state school building and a heritage listed courthouse. The aim of this, a bit like those embodied energy studies I showed before, was to show instantly recognisable archetypes, those places people would recognise in their street or in their suburb. And we took our very popular publication, What House Is That?, as a starting point. And the vast majority of these are the kinds of places you'll find on local heritage lists or in precincts. Now, this project was extended to the other states and territories. It had already gathered quite a lot of momentum with organisations like Sustainability Victoria, the Department of Sustainability and Environment in Victoria, the Building Commission and the Office of Victorian Government Architect, but we were able to extend this to take in examples from Queensland, the Northern Territory, Tasmania and New Zealand, and also to undertake modelling in some other jurisdictions, so in a couple of locations in New South Wales. The purpose of this study was, one, to identify the quantum of embodied energy in these typical houses, to assess the energy in use, and I think this is most important, to undertake life cycle assessment on 50 and 100-year lifespans for these buildings, so looking at both embodied and energy in use over those lifetimes. Testing a number of common interventions to improve energy and water efficiency, and then the identification of a range of suitable design solutions targeted to each type and location. And that's the stage we're at now. We have this data, we have the final report in, and we're now at the point of developing case studies and fact sheets for the public, for designers and building surveyors, so people can make more informed choices about how to effectively retrofit these buildings.